Welcome to episode 12 of Riff and Chips. I'm your host Phil Vernon, and on today's episode we welcome James Lee, guitarist in Hull-based HM2 thugs Mastiff. Mastiff released their latest album, The Precipice, in March of this year to well-deserved critical acclaim. It's a perfect angry and vicious blend of sludge, grind and metallic hardcore, which somehow managed the almost impossible task of taking another step up in quality from its incredible predecessor, Leave Me the Ashes of the Earth. I caught up with James shortly after they had finished up a successful UK headline run in support of the album. Join us as we discuss the legendary Hull scene of the mid-2000s, the difficulty in keeping a scene thriving in smaller towns and cities, and Hull's most famous condiment, chip spice. A quick announcement before we start. We've partnered up with the awesome team over at UK distro site 783punks.com to provide an exclusive discount for Riff and Chips listeners. Head over to 783punx.com and use code Riff and Chips at the checkout for 10% off everything in store. James, welcome to Riff and Chips.
Hello. Thank you for having me, Phil.
No worries.
Absolute pleasure. Been very much enjoying the show so far.
Thanks very much. Now, obviously, you guys are one of the bands that encouraged this pod into existence in the first place on Twitter.
Yes, very much so.
So it's only right we had you on at some point. Now, let's start by talking how you initially got into heavy music as a whippersnapper.
As a wee little one. Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose my sort of path into it was a very kind of gradual gradient, sort of light rock music when I was a kid. Like, a very sort of fond memories of listening to my dad's like Queen LPs with like giant headphones in the sort of like late 80s, early 90s. I guess when I was at secondary school, I had like older brothers and a couple of friends at school that sort of turned me on to, at the time, like it was in the middle of the Britpop boom, but I like got into, Blur and Supergrass and then like Radiohead, and it just sort of spiraled from there. Like, that went from, I then discovered like Nirvana and the Smashing Pumpkins, and then started buying Kerrang and, seeing pictures of Slipknot and thinking, what the fuck is this? And I think it was like the sort of first big breakthrough for me was probably Deftones. Like, I bought White Pony sort of not too long after it came out, and that just like re-sculpted my brain. And that then, I suppose a thing that like a lot of people did back in the sort of pre-streaming, pre-social media days is like, you find new bands and new music by looking at who the bands that you already like talk about or who they tour with. I think through like really loving Deftones, that led me into discovering the first Glassjaw album.
Okay, yeah.
Everything You've Wanted to Know About Silence. And that was sort of the first time I'd ever heard like hardcore, or I mean, it's not really metalcore, is it? But just like screaming and really kind of like pummeling riffs. But it wasn't, it wasn't the same as Korn or, Slipknot or anything that I'd heard before. There was something quote unquote real about what I heard with Glassjaw, and then that again sort of spiraled off. Through that I heard bands like Poison the Well, and my tastes just sort of like circled downwards into harder and faster and nastier kinds of music as time went along.
Yeah. I mean, you're almost kind of mirroring my kind of way in there, really. It's maybe not necessarily the Britpoppy stuff as such, but like you say, those kind of the Slipknot bands, and then straight into the kind of the Glassjaws, the Poison the Wells, anything that was around it then, the Dillingers, things like that. I think, especially for people that are maybe on the more extreme side or got into the extreme side earlier, I think that was the back door in for a lot of people. You were talking there about how, you got into bands by seeing who other bands toured with and who they talked about. I know a big thing for me used to be reading magazines or even like band photo shoots, like what t-shirts are the guys in the band wearing.
100%.
Like I heard of so many bands from looking at like the t-shirts that other people in bands were wearing and stuff.
I still do. It's still like whenever we go off on tour, like one of my biggest dilemmas the week leading up to going off is like, how many t-shirts do I take with me? Which ones do I wear at which shows? Because I'm like, when I see a band, and it's not always 100% accurate, but you can make a pretty good estimate on whether you're going to like this band based on like what merch they're wearing. So I'm always really, I put a lot of thought into what I take on tour and what I wear on stage. So.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's a huge thing.
So obviously we talked about a lot of overseas bands there.
Yeah.
What sort of UK bands were the first ones that sort of, especially like UK heavier bands that kind of like gripped you?
I mean, I suppose like, again, that sort of like early, like very late 90s, early 90s Kerrang era, I know I've just been listening to your episode with Dave from 100 Year Old Man. You were talking about 1 Minute Silence and like they were, you know, a big band that were sort of around at that time. I suppose being stuck in Hull, we didn't have like a particularly thriving music scene. So there were like a few kind of like local bands that I sort of got into at the time. But I guess really it was a little bit later on when it was more like when I started playing music and like my first band started playing shows, that's when I really got introduced to sort of what was happening in the like UK heavy scene around the sort of early to mid noughties. Being a Yorkshire band, you know, we were around sort of when like Bring Me the Horizon and Roller to Massey were like first starting out, and then bands like, you know, The Nothing and Derail and all of these like amazing kind of like metalcore and metalcore adjacent bands.
I was going to ask about kind of what the local scene was around you at the time, because like you said, the only things I can remember, especially around those kind of mid to late 2000s, were those all dayers they used to do at the Welly.
Yeah.
And seeing those on shows and stuff. So yeah, I wasn't sure what the kind of local scene was like outside of that.
Those Welly shows were incredible. The Hull Metal Fest of a legendary show, 2007. I think that was a brilliant show. As much as anything, because like I'll apologise now, the name of the promoter escapes me at the moment, but like the dude that booked it managed to pull like the Red Chord and Dead to Fall and like Iron Dissonance from Second Story Window, like all these real, like not even like the sort of like big obvious like US bands at the time, like some like really kind of cool bands to it. But the coolest or at least funniest thing that happened was Ollie Sykes and Bring Me the Horizon turned up. This story came out after the fact. They'd been the first band that were approached to play, and they like flat out turned it down. No thanks, we're too big for this.
Yeah.
And then like when the lineup poster came out, and this, you know, they obviously saw all these cool bands that were playing. They then got back in touch. Was like, oh yeah, we will play. And the promoters were like, no, fuck yourselves. Like, you know, we weren't cool enough for you. Like, and so on the day he like rocked up, tried to like sweet talk his way in on the door. No one would let him in, so he just like hung around outside waiting for people to notice him and fawn all over him. And so there used to be like a Netto supermarket just around the corner from the Welly, and a bunch of lads went and bought like 3 dozen eggs or something and like pelted him with eggs until he got in his car with his tail between his legs and drove off. That was a classic story.
It's a classic folklore tale, isn't it?
Just a fun story that I had to get in there. But like going back a bit more, I mean, Hull's it's a strange little place. I mean, you know, we're sort of like tucked away at the arse end of nowhere. We're not really on the route to anything. So certainly back in those days, and now to a degree, like tours don't tend to pass through Hull because we're not on the way to anywhere else.
Yeah.
So we're not an easy stop off. It makes sense for a band to do like Manchester and Leeds and Sheffield, and like because they're, you know, you can just sort of pass through all of them on your way either north or south. Whereas Hull, it's like you have to go like an hour or so out of your way from wherever you are, and then work your way back out. So we got ignored a little bit, but then I guess around the sort of, maybe sort of 2004 through to about 2007, a few local dudes sort of took it upon themselves to like pull Hull up by its bootstraps. And we had this like amazing few years where we got all these really big bands came through. I remember in 2005, I think it was, in the space of like a couple of months, we had like Municipal Waste, Red Chord and Cursed all played at like this like 150 cap club in Hull, which was, wild. And then there was a really weird, like, it looked like a sort of old rockabilly pub, but it was like rough as fuck place called the Ringside. They had a function room of it, and that place, like, again, was this sort of like hub for a lot of the kind of hardcore and metalcore bands. Again, like Horizon played there, Roller to Massey played there. One of the first quote-unquote big gigs my band ever played was we opened for Horse the Band there.
I remember seeing that venue on posters and stuff quite often, tour posters or flyers and stuff. Yeah,
it was shit. I mean, it was a complete shit venue. Like, it was one of those, like, they didn't have like an in-house sound man. It was usually just like whoever at the gig felt most competent to like turn the knobs was the sound guy for the night. And, you know, it was like they only had like 3 microphones or something. So it was like you maybe got like a snare drum and the kick drum mic'd up. If the band had 2 singers, just the kick drum. Everything else was, you know, you just had to crank amps and hope for the best. So it always sounded like shit, but yeah, a lot of wild shows happened in that room. So it's, you know, a lot of fun memories.
Yeah, it's good when someone takes it upon themselves to like try and drag a scene into a town that maybe doesn't kind of normally have one.
Yeah.
I was chatting to Bobby from Blanket the other day, and he's from Blackpool, and he was saying the same. Bands don't need to pass through it. Similar to kind of like Liverpool in a way. No one's passing through Liverpool. You have to kind of go out of your way to get to it, sort of thing. So trying to grow scenes in those places and attract bands to come to them sort of thing was always a bit harder, and it needed someone to kind of really make an effort to kind of draw these bands in. And I think that's why a lot of these smaller towns, I noticed it a lot over the 2000s, there'd be a period of maybe 2 or 3 years where, you know, you say there was a Hull for a bit. I remember there was a spell where there used to be a lot of shows, probably for a bit longer, but like Canterbury, a lot of like hardcore shows.
Yeah.
And then you had like the Yeovil scene for a few years, like the Ski Lodge and the Orange Box and stuff. I think that's probably why a lot of these scenes only have this little 2 or 3 year lifespan, because if that one person who was dragging all these bands in and really making the effort decides to step away, it just disappears again.
Yeah, totally, man. And like at the time, I mean, when all this stuff was happening, you're all talking like most of us that were involved in the scene at the time were like, you know, 20 to 24 at the most. A lot of people still lived at home with their parents, probably, you know, didn't have great jobs. So like, and you know, like these are like times when, you know, you had to like practically coax people into your shows, however good the lineup was. So it's like £2-3 on the door. If you dared charge a £5, people would be like, oh, you're getting too big for your boots now. So it was like, you know, the promoters weren't making any money. The bands definitely weren't making it. I mean, we must have played dozens of shows just opening up for whoever was passing through Hull. And, you know, we never got paid anything. And so there's no wonder promoters in scenes like that have like a limited lifespan on them, because, you know, there's only so many times you can have to fork out, you know, hundreds of pounds out of your own pocket to cover these like costs, which, you know, like they're absolutely entitled to and have earned. But there's only, when you're a young person with limited funds, you can't keep bankrolling this shit if people aren't turning out. It seems to have been like that in Hull over the decades, sort of, you know, these sort of massive peaks and troughs. Like we had a really good few years, I guess, sort of 10 years ago up until like 2 or 3 years ago. There was a sort of promoter collective in Hull called the HNC, the Hull Noise Collective, and they basically just operated out of like a rehearsal studio, which is where Mastiff practices now. And they were just like, you know, donation-based shows because, you know, they couldn't like properly advertise them as like paid shows because it's an unlicensed venue. So it was just sort of really DIY stuff. But they've pulled in like incredible bands over the years. You know, in that tiny little room, I've seen everyone from like Employed to Serve to Svalbard to fucking Caligram to, you know, all these unbelievable bands. Yeah. And then like even bands like Anthropocalypse or like Birds in Row and Hierophant, just these like great European, even like American bands have come over. And again, it was like wild and awesome, but then eventually the promoters sort of lost interest, either because they weren't getting anything out of it anymore, or, you know, people just weren't turning out to shows anymore, and it just died again. There were always reasons. People, you know, have a lot of things to spend their money on, and they can't always prioritize going to spend like 5 hours in a windowless room getting shouted at.
Yeah, exactly. And like you say, it's even harder in, I guess, what you class as smaller towns or the B towns rather than the big cities. There's not as big of a population, so you're kind of preaching to a smaller pool. So you're expecting that same 100 or 150 people to come out every week or 2 or 3 times a week. And like you say, people just can't do it. You know, as soon as you're in a bigger city and, you know, you've got 500,000, 1 million people to kind of preach at, you only need 10% of that metal group to maybe come out to a show every now and again. And there's enough there to kind of keep it going. And I think that's why, like you say, especially in the smaller towns, it's just so hard.
It is. And it's you know, it is a shame, but, you know, hoping maybe it'll pick up again at some point, and, you know, the next generation of plucky young upstart promoters will start sweeping through soon, and you know, they might kick off a new thriving scene. Like, I really hope so. It'd be really nice to see.
You know, obviously we've been talking about Mastiff there. You released your latest album, The Precipice, I was going to say last month, so if anyone's catching up, that's March 2024. For anyone that's not heard it, it's essentially just a vicious and violent, unrelenting onslaught for about 35 minutes. You feel like you've had the living shite kicked out of you by the end of it. And I mean that in the absolute most positive way. Like, it's stunning. Go on, listen to it if you haven't heard it. It's such a fucking great example of just a punishing record. Do you want to talk us through some of the influences and themes kind of behind the record?
I always find it interesting, like, once we've released an album and then sort of experiencing the reaction, seeing how, especially like the press, and seeing how reviewers like tackle it and how they pull it to pieces. Because a lot of the time, you know, like, people that are dissecting it are finding things in it that, like, we definitely didn't intend, or, you know, like, not to say that we go into writing a song or an album with no vision, but Mastiff have been a band for like a decade. I've been in Mastiff for like 7 years now. we know what we're doing. Like, we know where we're coming from sonically. We know what kind of atmosphere we want to set. I mean, everything you just said about the album is completely bang on. You know, we're about pummeling and just being as sort of abrasive and you know, sort of vicious as we can be. And that, you know, not doesn't necessarily always manifest in the same way. I'd like to think that, you know, we're at least sort of versatile enough that we can change the shape of how that pummeling arrives to the listener. But I mean, a lot of the time we write our songs primarily like instrumentally first. I mean, Jim's always kind of like, when we're like in the rehearsal room bashing new stuff out, Jim's always sat in the corner with a notebook and taking notes. But like, we don't necessarily write the music with pre-knowledge of what the song's going to be about.
No.
It sort of feeds the other way in that Jim will sit there and I guess sort of like feed off the vibe of, you know, whether it's like a fast, harsh song or whether it's something a bit more like lumbering and sludgy. And then he'll delve into his sort of bag of hatred and pull something out. So the single Void that we released a few weeks before the album, I actually wrote the lyric to that one. And I wrote it after we recorded the album with Joe at No Studio. Shout out to Joe Clayton. He's the best at what he does. We sort of did all the instrumental tracking, and Jim, with all the best intentions, started recording vocals, but he'd partied a bit too hard while, you know, for the first few days while we were tracking guitars and drums and stuff, and he'd shot his voice out really quickly. So we basically finished the main tracking, and then Jim went back a month later to redo the vocals. In the interim between the two sessions, my mum passed away. Obviously that, was quite devastating. And so there was this one song which, you know, ended up being Void that Jim had like a few ideas for, but he'd not really settled on anything and nothing was really like sticking for him. Mm-hmm. And so I asked him if I could have a crack at it, and he was like, please, you know, just, you know, do whatever you need to do with that track. So I, you know, just sort of spewed out everything that was sort of bubbling away in my brain. That's how that song ended up as it is. And, you know, it sort of fit the vibe of everything else we're doing. I mean, like, Jim writes a lot about sort of loss and tragedy. You know, Jim lost his son Isaac when he was only 5 days old, quite a few years ago now. But, you know, that's obviously that's not a pain that ever disappears. It's not something that you get over, really. So I don't think anyone would ever, you know, sort of begrudge him sort of going back to that particular well of inspiration. Inspiration seems like a weird word for that, but you get what I mean.
Yeah.
It's something, you know, that sort of sits on him every day. So he touched upon that again on this record, and around that, the rest of the album kind of took shape of being this sort of, and again, I'm not going to make it seem like we overthought this or there was a grand plan, because it just sort of fell together really, but ends up being a bit of a sort of meditation on grief and loss and sort of feeling that teetering on the void, you know, just like staring into the dark and being one step away from just disappearing into it.
I mean, there's a reason why so many records are kind of based on, of all the emotions that exist. If you say a record is on a particular emotion, I imagine love and grief are the two emotions that make up any 80% of probably any record, because they're probably the two strongest emotions that anyone feels. You know, happiness can be short and fleeting sort of thing, and I know you could say this here about love, but, you know, grief is something that can last forever. You know, some people say get over things a little bit quicker. I guess it depends on how close you may be to a particular person or whatever, but it's such an overwhelming emotion that, you know, I think it's no surprise that those kind of themes and feelings around that might be revisited often, because they stick with you. Like, you know, you can say you never really get over something like that.
No, and you know, we present this image of like the miserable band from the miserable town, but we're all quite stupid, really. And we're, you know, if anyone's ever seen us live, you know that we have a laugh. There's no fog and grimacing, and it's, you know, we're quite silly on stage. And I think, you know, we allow ourselves to enjoy being the band, because through that creative process, we kind of treat that aspect of Mastiff as like, that's where we put all of the shit. When we're creating, that's when we're dumping all of our anguish and all of our like negativity and everything. You know, that's why, at least I hope, that's why our music sounds as abrasive and sort of quite intense as it does, is because when we're making it, we really are putting everything into it. And then once it's done and set to tape, then we can just have a beer and, you know, make some shit jokes and you know, make music videos where we're playing in a working men's club, and Harry from Berners wearing a shiny jacket and calling bingo numbers out. Yeah,
Yeah, and Smitten's the situation is on there as well.
He is. Shifty barman.
What a man! What a man!
What a man!
I'm still due to get him on. Like I'm looking forward to that chat when I finally get around to it.
I can't believe you've not done it yet.
You talked about recording with Joe. Now, obviously, you've worked with Joe on a few releases now.
Yeah.
Understandably, like I say, he's great at what he does. Another collaborator you've worked with multiple times is the incredible Paul Phillips,
Indeed.
which most people will know as True Spilt Milk. He's produced the artwork for both The Precipice, your previous album, Leave Me the Ashes of the Earth.
He did.
Other than him being fucking mint, what is it about his style that initially got you interested in working with him?
When we were sort of in the process of putting Leave Me the Ashes together, at the time we were kind of free agents. I mean, we were, we had a sort of, gentlemanly sort of agreement with APF, our old label. Shout out to Fieldy. What an amazing dude. But, we'd fulfilled any sort of contractual obligations we had to him. So when we were putting that album together, we were like, we didn't owe it to anyone. We had no label. We were just sort of doing it for ourselves. But for the first time, really, as a band, we'd managed to, at that point, amass, not lots, but like a little bit of money from like merch and also from the Cyberpunk thing.
Yeah.
Selling the song to CD Projekt Red, which, is another stupid story. But we, kind of made a decision reasonably early on that this is our opportunity to like do something a bit bolder and a bit sort of grander than we'd ever had the chance to do before. Like we'd always sort of cobbled artwork together for our albums ourselves, and like no discredit, like the two releases we did before, like Jim did the photography for Bork, our EP, and then Dan, our bass player, put the artwork together for Plague, which I still think is great, but we were, all very much in agreement that we wanted something a bit more professional, if I guess. And so we just sort of like set out to looking around and seeing what kind of options we had based on like the budget we had and just on whose art we liked. And pretty quickly, Paul's art, we all were just drew to it. It's that sort of incredibly like intricate style.
Yeah.
His art is so detailed, but it doesn't feel like anyone else's. Do you know what I mean? Like you get some artists that are incredible, but there's a sort of a faint whiff of someone else's idea to it. We didn't want to have our album with just like a knockoff Jake Bannon or like a knockoff John Baisley cover. Do you know what I mean? We wanted someone that had, their own sort of artistic voice. And so we reached out to Paul quite early on. It was a while before we even recorded the album, actually. And I think we sent him like song titles and we sent him and the album title, and we sent him some just like rough practice room demos that we'd just done pretty much for our own reference, just so we had like, something to listen to keep the songs in our heads. And he came back to us with 2 or 3 rough sketches, but straight away there was this like striking image of that and just against that stark black background, and we were like, oh yeah, that's it. And I think we only had to the only note we had for him initially, like the Mastiff like M logo was like in the middle of the vase, and we were like, okay, you move it up onto like the neck of the jug, and that was it. And that was the only note we had. He just smashed it. And then after the album came out, and then after we got signed to E1 at the time, which then obviously became Monarch. Again, we had a little bit more money behind us then, so we were like, well, shit, we should get him to do merch for us. So we drafted him in to do like 3 that then ended up being 4 designs based on like different tracks from the album. Again, just completely knocked it out of the park with every one of them. And so when it came to The Precipice, and again, such a long time before I think it was probably a year before we even recorded the album. And I don't think at that point we'd even recorded demos. We literally just gave him the album title. We said, this is what the new album's going to be called. Would you like to do it again? And he was like, yeah, let me knock up some ideas. And again, a little bit of time passed. He came back to us with like 3 concepts. And that one was just instantly jumped out at us. Simple idea, but executed so beautifully. And yeah, just that really sort of stark black and white imagery of the sort of tumbling figure like caught in this like roiling void between 2 seas. Yeah, we just loved it immediately, and it captured the sort of spirit of where we were shooting with the music. And same with Paul and with Joe, really. Like when you're in a band, you have this like fantasy of like, imagine if we could go and record at God City, or imagine if we could get fucking, like Jake Bannon to do our album art or something. But then it's like, that would be amazing. But like, we already have like this unbelievable support team behind us. Like we could spend thousands upon thousands of pounds, on doing things like that. And I don't think it would achieve us anything more interesting or like, more worthy than we've already got. And I just love both of those guys. And, we got to, considering he's been like drawing for us for like 4 years now, we actually met Paul for the first time on our tour like 3 weeks ago. The first time we ever met him in person, and he was just as wonderful a chap in the flesh as he is over emails. So that was lovely.
So, like you just said there, you just recently completed a UK tour with your Sin. That was obviously in support of the album release. So how did that tour go?
It went fantastic. It was a really, really great time. I think, it was only the second headline run we've ever done, but this time it felt like the most sort of like solid set of shows that we've ever put our name to as the top line band. I mean, obviously we did the tour with Avatar last year, which was a different planet entirely. But this tour was, for it being like under our banner, people turned out for every single show. We didn't have to play to any empty rooms. Great responses pretty much across the board. I mean, you always get, a couple of towns where you get people that, nod their heads, but don't really want to give you any more than that. But, that no one owes us anything. Enjoy bands how you want to enjoy bands. As much as anything, it was really taking Yasin out on tour with us was really fun. It felt like just having 3 extra members of Mastiff, really, because like we shared a van for most of it because they're only a 3-piece, so we all fit into one van quite cozily, and they're just as stupid and obnoxious as we are. So it was a match made in heaven, really. And they're absolutely killer band. Jaws visibly dropped when they realised that they were only a 3-piece, and then like they start playing, and the noise that comes out is this like ungodly mash of like D-beat and black metal, and they're just so fucking tight. It's just a really, really lovely experience being out with them.
Awesome. Should we get out some chippy chat?
I think that's a fantastic idea.
So as we mentioned before, you were very much one of the bands that encouraged me to get this pod going. So I'm hoping that enthusiasm for Chippy Teas a few months back on Twitter hasn't waned.
Oh, definitely not.
We're going to hit this hard. Okay, so what local chippy are you taking me to? Let's start off with that.
So I've got 2 options. 2 chippies that I frequent would be like a little bit misleading because I don't necessarily go all the time, but like they're my sort of 2 choices. So I've got one that's literally around the corner from my house, like a 30-second walk, called Dundee Fisheries. Mm-hmm. And then there's one that's about a 10-minute walk away called The Friary. They're both good, but they're sort of like complete opposite ends of the chippy spectrum.
Okay.
The Friary is very much like LED screens with the menus on and all shiny chrome countertops, and it's very modern, very sleek, boxes, all of the mod cons. And then on the opposite end of the scale, Dundee Fisheries is like cash only, ramshackle as hell. Like, I think their countertop, it's just like bits of random like 2x4s just sort of like nailed together with like a perspex screen stuck to it. It's really, looks from the outside, it doesn't look great, but Dundee always has a queue out the door.
That'd be the one that pulled me in. Like if they were next to each other on the street, like I'm sure, like you say, they're both equally as good, but if they were next to each other and I had to pick one, I'd be going straight into Dundee by the sounds of things.
Yeah, that's my general choice. The Friary, that typically we only go to the Friary if we're sort of eating a little bit later on, because part of Dundee's charm is that it has very sporadic opening hours. It's sort of like you kind of
all the best chippies do.
I feel like they don't actually really have like a set schedule of when they're open. You just take a gamble anytime you go out.
When they can be asked.
Yeah, exactly. And like stupidly as well, they definitely close at like tea time as well. So, you have to get in there early if you want it. So usually the Friary is our option if we want to eat a little bit later, or if we've sort of like just hedged our bets with time and realised that it's got away from us. And also the Friary do delivery. So even though it is only a 10-minute walk away, like that's still a 20-minute round trip. That I could save myself by having someone else just bring the food to me. But generally speaking, Dundee would be my choice.
What size kind of portions do Dundee chuck out at you?
Big. Like they're generous. I mean, I always opt for large. I don't think I've ever sort of consciously picked a small portion of chips when I've been to a fish and chip shop in my life. I'm very well aware there are chippies that a small portion could feed like a family of 4. But I'll still get the large one. I don't care. Like it for the
same. I don't want to chance it.
Yeah, and the difference is usually like 30p or something, and like for an extra 30p, like if I've got more chips than I could possibly eat in a week, I'll spend a week eating them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yes. They'll always heat up, won't they, the next day, or just as good cold. I'm not fussy.
No.
So we're getting a large portion of chips.
We certainly are.
What's your kind of main item you have with your chips then?
Fish. Just a bog standard. I like cod or haddock. I'm not really fussed. My granddad will be spinning his grave because my granddad was like a fishmonger by trade. So he was very particular about his choice of fish, but I really am not that fussed. I like them both. As long
Particular,
as
but what would he go for?
I couldn't tell you. That's bad on my part.
Oh, okay.
But as long as it's which I know Dundee is, as long as it's fried to order, which they do, which is good. You know, I'm not saying I wouldn't take a fish that's been sat under the heat lamp for God knows how long, but they're very like fried to order. So there's always a little bit of a wait, but it's always worth it. The fish are usually huge as well.
While you're having your little bit of a wait, do you order yourself a little snack while you're waiting?
You see, no, I don't. For me, eating is very much an event. It's the best part of the day usually is when you have your tea, and I like to savor the anticipation. So as much as they do have their like tempting little jars of snacks and things sat there, no, I like to just wait and be patient, get my food, and go home and just sit and unfurl the paper and just soak it all in that single experience. I don't like
on the telly.
Yeah, I've never really been one for eating on the go. Like, unless I'm like absolutely, like if I've got 10 minutes to get somewhere and I've not eaten and I have to like dive into Tesco and grab a sandwich or something. I really hate eating on the go. I like for it to be an experience and an event when I eat. So I'm not really up for just like standing in the queue at a chip shop munching on a sausage. No shade to anyone that does. But that's just not my style.
Like me 2 hours ago, yeah.
Yeah, it's just not my style.
Are you having plenty of salt and vinegar on chips? Do you specify how much you want?
Yeah, plenty. I mean, I tend to go like not super heavy on vinegar. I do like, it's an integral part of the chippy experience, but I don't want my chips like completely drowned in it. Definitely salt, and also being a Hull boy, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Hull's most famous delicacy, but every chippy and takeaway in Hull, you will find yourself presented with a topping called American chip spice, which is a whole phenomenon that is unbelievable and insane that it is not further widespread than this city. But it's basically, I mean, it's pretty similar to the like the peri peri salt you get on Nando's chips, but
okay, yeah,
but not quite the same. They have a very unique blend of sort of like paprika and spice and salt and pepper, and you buy them in little blue tubs. It's literally, I'm not exaggerating, every takeaway in Hull, chip spice is there as an option, and you go like 10 minutes out the city and it just disappears. It's weird.
I love that. I love those little local things that are so specific to somewhere. And like I say, I mean, it's the sort of thing 100% I'd try. It sounds like a bit of me.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, it makes it even more so, like the fact that I know I can't get it unless I go to that specific little spot. I've got to, from here, I'd have to drive 6 hours or somewhere to Hull to get a little bit of that on my chips. But yeah, I'd be super up for trying it.
Yeah, I lived in London for about 7 years, and my mum and dad used to like send me it. They used to send me like every few months. I'd get either they'd post some to me, or when I came home to visit, they'd have like a tub ready for me to take back to London with me.
That's amazing. That's love.
It's just indispensable stuff. Yeah.
Do you get any moisture with your chippy?
Yeah. So I like all of the sort of standard chippy sides. Mushy peas is probably my go-to.
Yeah.
I've been known to go gravy every now and again. Gravy tends to be more if I have like a chip butty. But yeah, if I'm having fish and chips, yeah, mushy peas, 100%. When I was growing up, I think because we used to eat fish and chips a lot. Again, fish trade in my family, so there was always a lot of fish. We didn't have a lot of condiments in my house, and the only things we ever had were like tomato ketchup and HP sauce. And I hated ketchup with a passion, mostly because my little sister used to drown all of her food in it, and it made me like, someone else overdoes something, and it just makes you like recoil from it.
Makes you poke a bit, yeah.
Yeah. So HP was my go-to, and I used to put brown sauce on my fish and chip, and I tend not to so much nowadays. But
see, I've never had it on fish and chips. I mean, brown sauce and chips, I could go.
Yeah,
loads, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's not something I go to nowadays so much, but it's still sort of every time I have fish and chips, even if I haven't got a bottle of HP handy. As to, when I have that like sense memory of being like, oh, we haven't got any, have we? Oh, and I sort of feel disappointed that I don't have any brown sauce. But yeah, no, mushy peas is good for me.
Did you get a tin of pop? And if so, what did you get?
Yeah, I'm very staunchly a Dr. Pepper man.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Goes well with the chippy. From how you've described it, I imagine the Dundee Fisheries would have a decent selection of good pops.
Yeah, it's pretty good. You get your sort of, your standard selection of, Coca-Cola products. You might get some like Rubicons and stuff like that.
Nice.
Probably like a few like Ben Shaw's, Dandelion and Burdock, or there might be an Iron Brew in there as well.
So they're quite chippy staple, good selection, really.
Yeah.
Ben Shaw's, like you say, you would never really get a lot of that down here.
No.
Obviously, Liam from Hidden Mothers mentioned that would be his go-to, a Ben Shaw's shandy.
Yeah.
It's very much kind of like a Yorkshire thing. But yeah, I mean, I'd get Dandelion and Burdock from a chippy if I could. But there's not really anywhere down here that does it, I don't think. Not my local ones, anyway.
That's a damn shame. Dandelion and Burdock's a great drink.
Yeah.
If Dr. Pepper's available, I'll always go that. I mean, if I lived in a perfect world, every sort of outlet in this country would have A&W root beer, and I'd drink that non-stop all day, every day. But unfortunately, that's confined to overpriced American sweet outlets. So
yeah, that's the only problem with stuff like that, isn't it?
I tend not to get that very often. But so Dr. Pepper's like the best sort of everyday choice.
Right, so in our next section, we give you the chance to sell yourselves a bit to the listeners. So we like to call this section... So anything exciting coming up for Mastiff between now and the end of the year?
Disappointingly not at the moment. Obviously, we just finished the album tour, and we've got a show that we're putting on ourselves in Hull in September, which we've not announced yet, so I won't say any more about that yet, but that should be cool. But no, I think we've released our album at a sort of a bit of a funny time. We've kind of missed the window to like hop onto any of the festivals or anything this year. I think we're hoping that some of the like festival organisers are paying attention to the the little buzz that we've got going on around it now and might keep us in contention for next year. But we've just started writing again. Like last week was the first rehearsal that the band has had where we've attempted to write any new material, which is unusual for us. We've usually got, by the time an album comes out, we've usually got at least a couple of new tracks like that we're already kind of like itching to, start playing, even though we know we shouldn't. I think because the process of putting The Precipice together took a lot longer than our albums usually do, it still feels like a new record to us as well as to everyone else, whereas usually by the time an album comes out, I mean, we did record it like a year ago, but it's for some reason it still feels fresh in our heads, whereas usually by the time we put something out, it's like we're already not over it, but you know what I mean? Like we're sort of gearing up for doing something new. So at the moment, which is good really, we're still just excited about this album that we just released. So I suppose if I'm going to plug anything, it's that little album that we released a few weeks ago. And I'd personally just love to thank everyone that's already listened to it. I think it's already like our most listened to album on Spotify, which is mental considering it's been out like a month. But just everyone that's like said nice things about it, anyone that's bought a copy already, like, thank you, you're awesome. But yeah, if you haven't checked it out, if you've not listened to Mastiff at all before, I mean, I can't blame you. Give it a go. If you like music that makes you see red and punch walls, then yeah, please check it out, listen to it, stream it, buy it.
James, I think that should do us for the show.
Beautiful.
But thanks so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me, Phil. It's been lots of fun.
Yeah, no problem, mate. Take care of yourself, and I'll catch up with you soon.
You too, man. Thanks.
That was James from Mastiff. He took me to Dundee Fisheries in Hull. He got large chips with a fish. Could be cod, could be haddock. He's not fussed, unlike his granddad. He'll have salt and vinegar, and being a Hull lad, he's obviously getting chip spice too. He'll have some mushy peas on the side and wash it down with the Dr. Pepper. As always, I want to see your chippy teas too, so don't forget to tag us in any pics or let us know your favourite local chippy on socials using @RiffandChips. Thanks to Rob Collier for providing the dive bomb, Edgar Gibbs for the screams, and Ryan Westwood for the artwork. See you in a week's time for our next episode.